Alright, woodworkers, door makers, we are going to get into a conversation about proper joinery for door making. And so there's a couple of things that we need to talk about as far as the strength as well as some of the techniques to hiding some of the other elements. So with making a door, we're going to start with cutting a groove on the inside edge here. This will go around, this will capture your door panel, and within this there's opportunities for us to sneak in some joinery here as well. So this is going to be a conversation in a later video about sizing and location of this, but for the most part just recognize we always start with this groove here, and this is for the stiles, so the vertical elements of the door as well as the rails. We always start with this thing, and then once we've got this, then we can start throwing in some joinery. Alright, so this door here, which is a good door, it's probably not strong enough for what it is we want to do with the door, which is to hold it together for years of this thing opening and closing. Any kind of trauma or force that's going to be imposed on this, if you have a knob or a pull, or maybe there's something that hangs on this, that will always put tension into the joints. So let me pull this thing apart. So with these joints, maybe that's good enough. Yeah, that's good enough. You'll notice two things. Number one, you'll notice that the tenon is slightly longer than the extension of the panel itself. As a solid wood panel, it will expand and contract. So I need to allow for a little bit of movement of this piece, the door panel, before it bottoms out on where the tenon is. That's going to push against the part that's holding on or gluing this into place. And so with that, that's a good start. So ideally when I put this together, I'm going to have glue here, same on the other sides as well, and that's going to be our door construction, and that's okay. It's not ideal, it's not great. Short answer is that it's just a little bit too short of what potential joinery there is on this location. So a lot of, if not all, cabinet manufacturers, so these are people that do kitchens and baths, they do this joint all day long. And so basically it's a version of a cope and stick. Basically we have a groove here, we have a well-fitting thing that fits into that groove, and that's okay. The big concern for me is that I want to make this tenon a little bit longer, and if it's just whatever this length is, hopefully you can see this, it's a little too short. And so I have good capture on the thickness. The length of this is about 5/8 of an inch, which is pretty substantial. That's a good length for this tenon, and I might be okay with this. This is a tiny door, so I think that this door was wider, longer, both. Then there's a lot of pressure being exerted onto these joints. You know, all it takes is for one of these to fail before they all start to become compromised, and you've probably seen that or experienced that in some capacity. So the reason that cabinet manufacturers can get away with this is that they typically don't use solid wood panels. They typically have some type of a sheet good in here, and that sheet good is somewhat more stable. It doesn't have the expansion that we need to worry about for solid wood panels. Because of that, they'll cut the panel to fit, so the full length of these tenons, and then they will adhere all the way around. And now that panel is a functioning structural element on assembling or keeping the door in place. And so that way we get a ton more glue surface and strength by doing that. So instead of this option, I've got something that's fairly well on the way. So building out a door here, so same deal. I started with this groove, and I fit these pieces accordingly into that location as you just saw, and I want these, that's tight, that's better. I want these to be well-fitting. I always talk about piston fit. I want to have a little bit of resistance as I get into this. This one feels better now. I'm happy with that fit, and it's got to be fit to the exact dimension of this groove, but not the entire length of this groove, or width of it, I guess. I need to measure it on the inside corners there and there. It's really easy if I'm fitting this rail into place for this to fit easily on the very start of this joint. The further down I push this, if that starts to open up or split the sides of this groove, then the tenon is way too thick. And so I need to be able to fit this so that looking at the bottom of this joint, there's good capture all the way across, and I don't have any shadows on the top or bottom. That means that I'm going to get good glue surface everywhere. Alright, so with that, you'll notice that there's a huge gap with this thing. So this tenon is much longer than that of just where the groove is. And that's by design. That's kind of what we want. So if I can show you what I've got going on here, you'll notice in this one there's a mortise on the inside of this thing. So we have a groove, we have a mortise. The mortise is going to be the part that allows us to slide more of this material into that location. And now we have mortise and tenon as functioning in this main joint. We also have this groove, which can absolutely be designed for additional glue surface. When we create something like that, we refer to that as something called a haunched tenon. The haunched tenon is the strongest version of tenons, but totally appropriate for door making. If you consider what happens in cutting this groove, and if we were to fit a tenon here without a haunch, and I'll go into more about what haunches are. I have another video, or a series of videos talking about what haunch tenons are. But it basically allows us to fit this thing in well. We have greater depth to take advantage of. It also will allow us to fill the top and bottom of this groove with tenon looking material. So to have a similar look to what you see on this piece, what you don't see is where this section ends, there's more joinery coming through here. So haunch tenon is what it is we want to do. We can't do it until we start to develop the groove. And so going from there, we get the groove cut out. We're going to fit these pieces to fit, and then they're going to have to be well over length, so that as the shoulder of this rail is going to go in here, I have maybe up until 3/8 of an inch of the outside edge of this door to be able to utilize for joinery. And so I've got a ton of strength there. Now, I'm laying these things out. Yeah, I'm going to show you on this side. No, I already did it there. Let me zoom in and I'll show you what I'm talking about. This may be tricky to see. I'll do my best. Alright, so yeah, that's sort of over here. So I know that I want the top edge of this rail to line up with the top of the stile. So I'm going to justify this all the way to my right to make sure that those are in a good fit. From there, I can draw in the overall length of this tenon. So from shoulder to the end of the tenon, that's going to butt up to this inside edge here to wherever the end of that tenon is. Now the other thing that I want to keep in mind is, with all good mortise and tenon joinery, I really don't want to bring that mortise any closer to the end grain here than about 3/4 of an inch. Sometimes a little bit less is okay, but let's just say I want to have good practice and go 3/4 of an inch from the end here to where this mortise starts. So all of this is going to be solid wood. I'm going to start to create a mortise inside of that. But where do I end this thing? Okay, so with having this line up to the top edge here, once again, because I cut this groove on the inside of the rails and the stiles, that's going to be where my mortise has got to start. So it goes from there, that's the length, and it's going to end from here over 3/4 of an inch, which gives me a tiny little mortise to start to drill into. And that's okay, because what I'm going to gain by doing this is I will have a tenon that corresponds with all of this. Remember the thickness, this area here and here, those are the critical glue surfaces. So if I don't cut the width of this tenon perfectly, or if I intentionally cut it undersized to be able to slide this thing in easier and possibly deal with a little bit of alignment during the process of gluing up, it's all totally fine. Again, once the thickness is dialed in, the rest of this stuff becomes a little bit more simpler to start throwing in. So then I need to know the length of this tenon in relationship to where this groove ends. So I'm going to make a little line right here. So I'll carry this line down. Oops. Alright, and so all of this material now gets cut out. So my joint is going to look just like this. I'm going to slide in here, this corner is gone. This is where my mortise is on the inside of this board, and then what is left behind is going to fit over where this groove goes. I hope that all makes sense. So that's kind of the concept of these things. If I've done that, you can see what I've gained by additional length, because my groove ends roughly right around here. And I really can't start doing any of the layout that I just did here without knowing the overall width that I have to start with. I can't do that till I cut the groove. I can't fit these things till the grooves have been established. And so, long story short is I always have to start with the groove. Okay. So once I've done that, this cut and this cut are not terribly critical. The thing that I need to worry about, as I've talked about here, this one is a little bit simpler to do because there's not a lot of glue surface that I need to worry about. This one is a little bit more critical simply because it'll be exposed if I'm looking at, forgive the burning here as I cut, but if the rail piece here, if that one's cut a little bit too short, or if it's a jagged cut or an angle or something, you'll start to notice that when this hull gets glued together. So keeping in mind that, I do want to make sure that that one is dialed in. In the video that I referenced that I did for cutting Haunched tenons, you'll see the process of setting up on a cross-cutting sled on the table saw, and I can dial those things in. And once I get the first one set up, then it just becomes an assembly line at that point. Okay. What else was I going to say? Okay, oh yeah. Overall length. So hopefully now you can kind of see how this plays out. And what I need to be conscious of or aware of is that I'm going to have a finished dimension outside edge of these doors, overall length. When it comes time to fitting this door into a carcass, I need to make sure that I have those dimensions intimately familiar with what it is I'm cutting. I want to cut the overall length of this thing just a hair longer than it wants to be. And by a hair, I'm talking about maybe a 1/16 total. So I have a 32nd on the bottom and the top to start trimming down. I'm talking about an inset door. Conversely, I also want to think about the overall width of this. And so I don't want to make this door so great that I need to start trimming off extra material on the door once it's glued up. So I want to get this as close as I possibly can so I can minimize the amount of paring or trimming that I need to do to get this thing to fit into the carcass. So what I do is, in order to find this length, I will measure out and I'll know the exact outside dimension edge to edge of this door, and then let's say this is going to be 11 inches, which I think is way too big, but let's say it's 11 inches. Then what I'll do is I'll subtract this width, and that's going to give me something closer to 1¾ times 2, that's 3½. So an easier way for me to do this would be setting these side by side. I'll make a little line, and I know that my overall width, is going to be 11. Oops. Alright, so 11 inches here to here, minus is going to be 3 3/8, let's say. So that means that I need to cut these pieces to, it looks like 7½, is what it appears to be. But you'll notice that this is longer than that 7½ because I didn't account for the interior length of this groove. So I have to make up that material here as this goes into place. I can't simply measure outside to outside, nor the length of that tenon joinery. So taking into account of all this, I need to factor in what this outside dimension here is outside of my mortise, and then the length or the width of this groove. So there's a little bit of math involved with sorting these things out. As long as I get the fit correctly here, it's easy enough to start trimming some of this back, and I could revisit cutting where my shoulders are. But for the most part, that's kind of the setup, and it's easy enough to get going. It's just like cutting dovetails, just like cutting any joinery, really. It's a lot of three-dimensional thinking about what specifically it is you're looking for. So do your best, get started with these things, keeping in mind that this is how the joint is going to look. Once you've done that, you're going to start to assemble really strong doors, and they'll serve you well for the rest of your life, which is kind of what we want. Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. See you.